KZ makes a lot of IEMs, all of them fairly affordable. This company has a loyal following and provides new audiophiles a chance to try various IEMs without breaking the piggy bank. Several months ago, KZ released the ZEX or Zex and the Zex Pro. A reseller on AliExpress asked if I would review the Zex, and I said yes. When I started using the Zex, KZ themselves contacted me and asked if I would review the Pro, and of course, I said yes. The Zex costs $22. The Pro costs $33. If you choose to buy the original Zex, please consider using the AliExpress link in the description section below. That seller was kind enough to send me the original Zex to review, and I want to make sure that they get a shout out. Let's compare these two options, and maybe we can figure out if one might be right for you. Both Zex products are electrostatic IEMs. KZ says that they require low voltage. The marketing says that these are noise cancelling. Well, passive noise isolation, not active noise cancellation. KZ says that the original Zex provides, quote, rich musical details. They say that their driver has, quote, better resolution characteristics and the loss of high-pitched sound and extremely high-pitched sound is reduced to the maximum, end quote. For the Pro, KZ says you'll get a wide sound field. They claim this IEM has, quote, more details and greatly improved high-frequency ductility. If you look at the marketing behind both products, you'll see a lot of vague, incredibly odd statements. Unfortunately, KZ does not provide a clear idea of how these IEMs should sound, much like almost any other IEM manufacturer. Both of these IEMs have similar build materials. They both use primarily plastic components. Both use a similar but not the same physical design. Both are light. Each IEM has a metal back. It's etched with KZ's logo. The majority of the body is see-through plastic. The Pro is larger than the original Zex. The Pro has a more contoured fit. Its design looks like it is a custom IEM shaped to your ears. It isn't, of course, but that's the general idea they were going for, I think. Both IEMs come with the same 2-pin cable. It's covered in plastic. It transmits some microphonics and seems reasonably sturdy. And frankly, I don't have any complaints. The IEMs also get the same number and type of silicone ear tips. The packaging does not include foam ear tips or a carrying case. As for comfort, I found both IEMs rather comfortable to wear. Both are light and sit within my ear cavities. I can wear both IEMs for about 3 hours before needing a break. Overall, the build quality is perfectly agreeable. These IEMs are light and I think pretty easy to wear for long periods. The accessories are acceptable, par for the course. They are leaps and bounds better than the accessories Blonde uses for the BL03 and the BL05. To test both IEMs, I use them with my RME 80i2 DAC, my Modi Liquid Spark Stack, the Lotu Paw 6000, and my EcoZerta ITM03. I use the stock accessories. I listen to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD. Both IEMs are super easy to drive. You don't need a dedicated amplifier. If you choose to use an amp, a modestly powerful one is plenty. I tested both IEMs individually to get an idea of their sound signatures. My tests indicate that the original Zex has elevated mid-bass. The Pro has closer to neutral bass tuning. In Mountains by Hans Zimmer, the Zex presented the sub-bass rumble that starts from the beginning of the song. The transients was about as fast as what I heard on the neutral Moondrop Quarks. Separation between sub-bass and mid-bass was also similar to what I heard on the Quarks. When the crescendo hit, the organ melded heavily with the other instruments. The rolling thunder effect was nearly as loud as the other elements. When the vocals chimed in, they rose from the background until they were a step behind the instruments. Switching to the Pro, the bass presentation was different. The Pro has less sub-bass emphasis and faster transients compared to the original Zex. In Mountains, the sub-bass rumble was audible on the Pro, but not as loud as on the original Zex. Separation between sub-bass and mid-bass was more obvious on the Pro. When the crescendo hit, the organ was clearer on the Pro. The rolling thunder effect was not as prominent as it had been on the original Zex. When the vocals chimed in, they rose from the background until they were about shoulder to shoulder with the instruments. In Conquer by Overwork, there is a sound of rolling marbles. This pans from right to left to center. The original Zex did present the sound, but none of the panning. There are multiple drums in this track, and the Zex presented all of them. Drum strikes were hard but not sharp or piercing. There was marginal melding from one drum strike to the next. Switching to the Pro, on Conquer, the Pro presented the sound of rolling marbles in some of the panning. It also clearly rendered the various drums. There was a bit more separation between each drum strike. Drum hits were not quite as hard as on the original Zex. I listened to several hip-hop songs including Pure Water, New Patek, Reel It In, and Uproar. On the original Zex, the sub-bass was easily audible in those tracks. The subwoofer sounded like it was about 5 feet away from me. The drums were slightly louder than the subwoofer. Vocals were one step ahead of the instruments. On the Pro, the sub-bass was less emphasized. The subwoofer was audible but seemed like it was at the other end of a medium-sized room. The drums were louder than the subwoofer. The vocals were clear and about 2 steps ahead of the instruments. I listened to my Sicario playlist. I used these songs to listen for audible bass distortion. Traversing from low to high volumes, I could not hear any distortion on either IEM. Overall, the bass presentation is different between the Zex and the Zex Pro. The original Zex has a bass emphasis. It is fairly significant. The Pro is closer to neutral. The Pro was clearer in the bass region. The original Zex seems to have slightly forward mids that are basically shoulder to shoulder with the drums. The Pro seems to have neutral mids. In Orla Gartland's song Why Am I Like This, there is natural vocal grain and sibilance mixed in. The Zex did present both details. It appeared to me that the sibilance was marginally emphasized compared to the neutral moondrop corks. This difference was rather minor but apparent in A-B comparisons. Orla's voice was essentially shoulder to shoulder with the drums. There was some melding between the drums and the guitar. On the Pro, Orla's vocal grain and sibilance were not emphasized. In fact, her voice sounded neutral, as on the Quarks. The vocals were clearer, more separated from the instruments on the Pro compared to the original Zex. The drums and guitar had marginal melding between them on the Pro. Orla's voice was 1 to 2 steps ahead of the instruments. In Want You Back by Haim, the original Zex again showed that it marginally emphasized the sibilance. It was a slight deviation from the Quarks presentation. At 8 seconds into the track, the primary vocalist says the word "we" and drags it out, making it sound gravelly. The Zex did present this detail, but it was slightly muffled. There are 2 backup vocalists, one in either channel. The Zex did present their voices, but they generally did meld into one voice. The vocals appeared shoulder to shoulder with the instruments. The drums, guitar, bass, and piano all melded a little with each other. The drums were typically the loudest instrument in the group. On the Pro, the sibilance I mentioned about this track was not emphasized. Its presentation was similar to what I heard on the Quarks. The gravelly vocals detail was clearly audible on the Pro. The 2 backup vocalists were easily audible, one in either channel. Their voices were clearer, more separated than what I heard on the original Zex. The vocals were usually 1 to 2 steps ahead of instruments. There was marginal melding between the drums, piano, guitar, and bass. In Superposition by Young the Giant, the original Zex easily rendered the ukulele, drums, and bass. The drums were louder than the ukulele. The primary male vocalist sibilance was neutral and smooth, sounding similar to the Quarks. There's a backup vocalist whose voice is layered beneath the primaries. Most IEMs and headphones cannot present this detail. The Zex could not either. Between 1 minute and 10 and 1 minute and 20 seconds, there are sharp intakes of breaths. The Zex made these sounds more like shallow gasps. On the Pro, the ukulele, drums, and bass were easily audible. The drums did not overshadow the ukulele as they had been on the original Zex. The Pro did not accentuate the sibilance in the male vocalist's voice. The backup vocalist was not audible, which was a similar result on the original Zex and the Moondrop Quarks. The Pro did render the sharp intakes of breaths between 1 minute and 10 and 1 minute and 20 seconds. The vocals were generally 1 to 2 steps ahead of the instruments. Overall, the original Zex tends to marginally accentuate sibilance, but that is not a significant deviation from neutral, I think. Vocals on the Zex are audible but sometimes overshadowed by drums. The Pro seems to have neutral mids with more clarity. The original Zex has a treble emphasis, starting in the mid-treble area, I think. The Pro seems to present close to neutral treble with a slight emphasis in the mid-treble region. In Scherzo for X-Winks, the original Zex rendered the brass and horns clearly, but there was some melding between their notes. The higher pitched notes were emphasized and louder than what I heard on the neutral Moondrop Quarks. This never appeared to be harsh or piercing to me. There was also some melding among the various group sets, though the Zex never sounded muffled. The timpani was a little exaggerated, but did not overpower the other instruments. The Zex has a true stereo effect and never presented depth, width, or verticality. On the Pro, the brass and horns were readily audible. They were separate from the other instruments. Their higher pitched notes seemed slightly emphasized compared to the neutral Moondrop Quarks. However, this was not a significant deviation. The timpani sounded similar to what I heard on the Quarks. In other words, it was not as emphasized as on the original Zex. There was obvious separation of the instrument group sets. The Pro rendered some width and depth, but no verticality. In Flight from the City, the original Zex made the piano sound like it was about 4 feet away. The bassy notes were exaggerated and did meld with each other. I could hear the pops and sizzles, but only at the beginning of the track. The cello was smooth, but melded noticeably with the piano. I could hear the creaking of wood on the pianist's bench, the shifting of the cello's weight. All elements appeared close to the ears. On the Pro, the piano sounded like it was about 6 feet away. The bassy notes were not emphasized, and there was little melding between each note. I could hear the pops and sizzles and electric buzzing without difficulty. The cello was smooth and marginally melded with the piano. I could hear the creaking of wood and the shifting of the cello's weight. In Take 5 of the Dave Brubeck Quartet, the original Zex rendered the piano in the right, drums in the left, the saxophone center, and the bass a step behind. The drums were generally as loud as the saxophone. The saxophone's higher pitched notes were emphasized and louder than what I heard on the Quarks. The cymbals are struck at varying positions, which should result in varying tonalities. The Zex made every cymbal strike sound the same. On the Pro, the placement of instruments was not the same as on the original Zex. The drums did not compete with the other instruments. The saxophone was about 1 step ahead of the other elements. Its higher pitched notes seemed marginally emphasized compared to the Quarks. The varying tonalities of the cymbal strikes were easily audible. Overall, the original Zex has a treble emphasis which is greater than what I heard on the Zex Pro. The Pro is closer to neutral. The Zex presents all treble instruments closer to the ears. The Pro appears to have greater separation and clarity. Neither IEM is a detail monster, but there are differences between them. The original Zex emphasizes bass, which bleeds into the mids, which might result in some mid-centric details being lost or more difficult to perceive. The Zex Pro, on the other hand, has a clearer rendition with more separation among elements. The original Zex does render obvious details, but the subtle and nuanced details typically found get lost in the mix. Thus, creaking of wood, shifting of a cello's weight, multiple vocalist twangs of guitar strings are not difficult to hear. However, sharp intakes of breaths sometimes sound muffled, multiple vocalists are not always clear and separate, and layered details might get drowned out by the bass emphasis. The Pro, on the other hand, presents what the original Zex does, but with more clarity. Thus, it is easier to hear multiple vocalists, sharp intakes of breaths, and other layered details in a mix. However, as I said, neither IEM is a detail monster. I have a quantitative test for detail retrieval. I use Kazuki's song New Light, which has layers of details. This includes the sound of wind, rustling of grass, children playing, synth, piano, and footsteps. I count the number of footsteps I can hear in the first 60 seconds. The Heidi's MS2 presents 8 to 9 footsteps. The Tin Hi-Fi T2 and T2 Evo present 7 to 8. The Moondrop Aria presents 7. The T2 Plus and the Blonde BL05 each present 6 to 7 footsteps. The The Audio Legacy 2 provides 6 to 7. The Moondrop Starfield presents 6. The Moondrop Quarks provides 5 to 6 footsteps. The Blonde BL03 presents 5 to 6 footsteps. The original Zex presented 5 to 6 footsteps, most which were a little difficult to hear. The Pro rendered 6 to 7 footsteps, which were generally clearer than what I heard on the Zex. For my detail resolution scale, I use the Moondrop Aria and the Starfield as the average performers. Any IEM that provides more or less footsteps is judged accordingly. Thus, on my scale, the BL03 would be considered below average and the T2 would be above average. Using this scale, it appears to me that the Zex falls in line with the BL03's performance. The Pro, which is clearer, does tend to render some additional details. Its performance is what I would characterize as average. There is a noticeable difference in soundstage between the original Zex and the Zex Pro. The Zex has no better than average soundstage, while the Pro has wider soundstage, which I would characterize as average to above average. The Pro presents more clarity, separation, and instrument placement. As with my detail test, my soundstage test also has a scale. For the sake of comparison, let's talk about soundstage of other IEMs. The Tin Hi-Fi T2 and Heidi's MS2 have above average soundstage. The BL03 and the 05S are average at best and perhaps slightly below average in Soundstage, depending on proper fit. The Starfield, Aria, Quarks, and Peacock Flight are about average. The original Zex seems to have soundstage that is similar to that of the Aria, in other words, at best, average. The Zex Pro has soundstage that appears to be somewhere between average and above average, a little bit wider than the Aria, but not as wide as the T2. KZ doesn't really offer much information to help understand the sound signatures of these IEMs. However, after repeated tests, I think I can generally describe what I heard. The original Zex, I think, is a bassy IEM with a balanced sound signature. KZ were able to keep the vocals clear enough so that they are not drowned out by the bass. The treble emphasis is not harsh or piercing. The details in soundstage are about average at best. The Pro, on the other hand, is a more neutral-sounding IEM. You get noticeably less bass emphasis, closer to neutral mids and treble compared to the original version of the Zex. You get more clarity, more soundstage, more instrument placement, and more detail. Two rather different sounding IEMs bearing the same name from the same company. This is a nice change of pace. Unlike the T2 and the T2 Plus, the Zex and the Zex Pro have divergent tunings, giving you at least some assurance that if you already have one, the other isn't going to be rinse and repeat. Whether you like either of these products is up to you. All I can say is that while neither product breaks new ground, they do tread that ground competently. Let's briefly compare the Zex and Zex Pro to a few alternatives. By now, you should have an idea about how these two products perform in relation to each other. But how about we put them against the Moondrop Aria and the Blonde BL Max? For this comparison, I used the stock accessories for all these products. I plugged them into my passive AB switch and plugged that into my Army 80i2 DAC. I listened to my test playlist on Amazon Music HD, and of course, I tried to volume match. The Aria has about as much bass emphasis as the Zex Pro. The original Zex has a noticeable emphasis in mid-bass compared to the Aria. The Aria is clearer than the Zex, but about as clear as the Pro in the bass region. Separation of sub-bass from mid-bass is slightly more obvious on the Pro. Mid-bass impact is hardest on the original Zex, followed by the Aria, and then the Pro. The mids on the Aria are recessed. They are at least one step behind instruments. The vocals on the Zex are about shoulder to shoulder with the drums and otherwise one step ahead of instruments if drums are not involved. On the Pro, the vocals are 1 to 2 steps ahead of instruments. The Pro is the clearest of the three in the mids region, with the least amount of melding among the mid-centric elements. Treble sounds most neutral of the three on the Pro. The Aria has a mid-treble boost with a roll-off in the upper treble. The original Zex has a mid-treble boost that seems to gradually increase into the upper treble. Regardless, both Zex products have brighter treble than the Aria. The Pro has more treble clarity than the other two IEMs. The Aria has the second most, and the original Zex is a close third. The Aria has about as much soundstage as the original Zex, but demonstrated a bit more detail. The Pro has wider soundstage than both, and about as much detail as the Aria. The BL Max has significantly greater bass emphasis than the Zex Pro. This is a night and day difference. The Pro is clearer in the bass region and has greater separation of sub-bass from mid-bass. The Max also has greater bass emphasis than the original Zex. Mid-bass impact is harder and sharper on the Max, followed by the original Zex and then the Pro. The mids are rather different on the Max. They are forward and sibilant compared to the Zex products. Both the original Zex and the Pro have vocals that sound closer to neutral compared to the Max. The Max places vocals closest to the ears, followed by the Zex and then the Pro. The Pro sounded the clearest in the mids region, followed by the Max and then the original Zex. The original Zex had the greatest amount of bass bleed into the mids. Separation of mid-centric elements was greatest on the Pro, then the Max, and then finally the Zex. Treble is also quite different. The Pro has the closest to neutral rendition. The Zex has an emphasis in the mid-treble with a slight upward departure in the upper treble. The Max seemed to mimic the emphasis of the Zex. Both of them sounded similar. Separation of treble instruments was similar between the Zex and Max, while the Pro appeared to have the greatest amount of separation. The Zex has about as much soundstage and detail as the Max. The Pro has slightly wider soundstage than the Max and a bit more detail, clarity, and more obvious instrument placement. Comparisons like these help us figure out whether new products are really worth considering. Here, it is clear that the Zex IEMs are different sounding than the Aria and Max. All of these IEMs share some commonalities. However, none sound identical. While none of these products will blow your mind with respect to detail, soundstage, clarity, or placement, they all have their own unique spins on presentation. Whether you will enjoy any of these products is something you will have to discover on your own. I don't have a lot of experience with KZ products, but it is evident just on reviewing the KZ lineup that this company has a lot of options for audiophiles. Whether all of them are good is debatable. In the last few years, I've been able to experience a variety of IEMs. Some of them were exemplary products, while others I find difficult to recommend. There's just so many IEMs in the market that it's impossible to say that one particular product is the best. As far as the Zex and Zex Pro are concerned, I was rather pleased to see a couple of affordable options that have noticeably different sound signatures. It's a real pleasure to pick up two IEMs from the same company and immediately hear a difference between the two. The Zex is a bassy IEM with less clarity, less separation, less detail, less soundstage, and more treble than the Zex Pro. The Pro has wider soundstage, a closer to neutral presentation, and a less intimate rendition of music. The original Zex makes everything sound close to the ears, while the Pro pushes things further back. Both products have very good build. The construction material is perfectly agreeable. The cables are nice. The ear tips work and are fairly comfortable. You don't get the bells and whistles with either. No carrying bag, no foam ear tips, no variety of silicone ear tips, and certainly not luxury packaging. But in return, you get two IEMs that cost well under $40 each, and each with a different sound signature and performance. This brings us to value. Absolutely. I think both the Zex and the Zex Pro are value. While you may not like their sound signatures, you cannot deny that both products have competent construction, reasonable accessories, and a sound that will at least be a little different from the rest of the group of IEMs. I have no complaints about the price, build, or performance. I cannot suggest that either is a giant killer or that one has amazing qualities far above their price range. I think that's a little nonsensical. What I can state without hesitation is that if you are inclined to purchase an IEM for cheap, then these two versions of the Zex give you different sounds to choose from for an affordable price.